Thank you so much. So, folks, we'll start up the afternoon very close to on time. We have a panel discussion coming up immediately. Let me just remind you, though, if you're just joining us for the first time, that the way in which we can receive questions is through the chat facility on Zoom, and that those are being monitored at this end and forwarded, provided to the chair at the time. So the next panel discussion is entitled Decolonizing Heritage in Manitoba. One thing I was asked to say about this was that a particular individual, Tasha Hodgson, had a lot to do with actually making this panel discussion happen. And we want to acknowledge that and say thank you to Tasha. Now, my role is simply to introduce to you the moderator and then invite him to introduce his panelists. Our moderator today is Dr. Niigaanwewidam Sinclair from the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Niigaan, can I turn it over to you now?
Okay, so bonjour ndewe magraduk, Niigaanwewidam Indigenous Namagosh Dodem, Niigaanwewidam Omayayan. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Niigaan Sinclair, and I'm associate professor at the University of Manitoba, the Department of Native Studies. I'm the acting head of the department due to a very tough situation involving our current department head at the moment. So I've got many different things that are in my life right now and kind of floating around. But I'm also a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. And so I write columns which appear on Tuesdays and Saturdays mostly, although this week was a bit of a disruption with Orange Shirt Day and things like that. And so I write columns with Winnipeg Free Press. I also do curation work. So I'm the curator of Indigenous content and inclusion at the Forks site. So I do all of the overseeing of the programming. One of our amazing exhibits, KC, was a part of the Niimama installation at the South Point at Niigaanwewidam, what we call Niigaanwewidam, the Two Rivers space on the South Point of the Forks. And today we're going to talk about, the title of this panel is Decolonizing Heritage in Manitoba. And so, I mean, first off, the whole idea of decolonizing might be something in which we want to talk about, and then also the challenge, what was often referred to as indigenizing. And so I think that might be a tension in which we might want to talk about when it comes to heritage in Manitoba. And the question that we're going to try to tackle today is, how can we advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and address the legacies of historical injustice, and particularly the situations involving heritage, the exploitation of heritage in the past, and then also the denial of heritage, and then the revitalization of heritage. How can we examine these in a modern context? And, you know, simple, we can do this in an hour, no problem, you know, and we'll, no doubt we'll probably have a few different things that we want to talk about in our wonderful panelists. I'll introduce them in just a second. I also want to acknowledge many of the Indigenous peoples who are watching right now, who are texting me and saying, I better do this good. Better do this well. Actually, probably good if we're talking about people from Selkirk. And so I know my sister's watching, so like right away, I'm getting texts like, hey, why are you talking this way, or whatever. So anyways, miigwech to all of everybody who's come in. We have, you know, over 160 audience members or people who are watching right now. So it's really a pleasure to be able to spend this time with you. So I want to introduce our amazing panelists. We have one taped submission as well, so we're going to get a chance to share all of this and have some conversation. Each of our panelists are invited to speak for 15 minutes about their area of talking about decolonizing, or I would also encourage indigenizing, talking about heritage in Manitoba. And so I'll introduce all three, or actually all four, and then we'll go from there. So the first person I want to introduce is not just a friend of mine, but also a relative, a cousin, who's Cree, Anishinaabe, and British from my community of St. Peter's Indian Settlement / Selkirk. Is Casey Adams. Casey graduated from Concordia University, the Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, is not only a person who is a well-known national, international artist, has featured at places like Urban Shaman and internationally in overseas in Australia, New Zealand, but has also helped us in Manitoba to be able to bring Indigenous heritage to light and to the ways in which in public installations. And so Casey has not only been involved with the Niigaanwewidam installation, which I spoke about before, but is also currently working on a installation at the Forks that is talking about treaty history and talking about Manitoba's history as well. And so really remarkable to welcome you here, Casey. Miigwech for coming and being a part of the Manitoba Heritage Summit. Next person I want to introduce is Kevin Brownlee. Kevin is a person who I've known for so long that I feel like he's like a cousin, he's like a brother. Maybe he doesn't want that, but too bad. We're part of it anyways. And so, he comes from Norway House, so the Kinesillaw Cree Nation. And he's been with the Manitoba Museum for a number of years as the curator of archaeology. One of the most amazing things about Kevin is he's a community-grounded person who's been able to work in Indigenous communities and been able to bring the messages of Indigenous communities, the heritage of Indigenous communities to light in what has historically been museums, not just the Manitoba Museum, all museums, has been very colonial structures, very structures that have been highly problematic when it comes to representing Indigenous peoples. And Kevin has been at the forefront, at the cutting edge of bringing Indigenous voices into those conversations, and going all the way back to 1993 when he was an archaeology summer student with the government of Manitoba, to the work that he's done now for almost 30 years. I just said that to make you feel old, by the way. And so 30 years of incredible work. And one of the recent installations I got a chance to see is the work that he's doing with what we're calling the Peace Meeting site at the Forks, involving a treaty that was made nearly 1,000 years ago, way before Europeans had ever come to this territory. And Kevin's done incredible work in that area, and I hope he mentions some of it as well. Our third panelist is again, another person, I feel like I'm hanging out with my friends here, is Dr. Adele Perry. Dr. Perry is a person who probably doesn't need any introduction for people in the terms of history, but she's a person who's very active on social media. She's an educator, she's an advocate, she's a researcher in working at the University of Manitoba. She's also a tremendous supporter of the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's basically a faculty member without getting any of the credit on all of our committees and supporting our graduate program. She's the director of the Center for Human Rights Research and a former past president of the Canadian Historical Association, and has written incredible things about the impacts or the exploitation of water at Shoal Lake 40, which ended up in the aqueduct into Winnipeg. And you can take a look at some of her work, not only in terms of her books, but her articles in that area. I have constantly referred, I'm sure she's probably be annoyed by it, but I constantly refer people to speak to Dr. Perry. And so we're real honored to have Adele to join us for today. And our fourth panelist, who will be joining us via a taped presentation, which will be entitled Changing Times and the Need for a New Flag, will be Ms. Stan Fontaine, who, for many of you that know, Stan has been a long-term elder and knowledge keeper from Sagkeeng First Nation, has many university degrees, and has worked as an instructor, administrator, and has worked in Brandon, and for decades has advocated for the involvement of our traditions. But one of the things that Stan's most done is looked at the connections between Catholicism and traditional beliefs, traditional spirituality. And so I think that's going to be an incredible contribution really at the end. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to hand it over to KC to start us off. Each panelist is going to give their greetings, and you got basically 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to keep it as close as I can to be able to keep us on time. So I'll offer the space and the mic here to, I guess the box on your screen is what I'm really offering, which is crazy. But anyways, is to Casey Adams. So KC, go ahead.
Anse, Kapapama Piminat, Mikasua Squayo, Nitisinakason, Ni Mama Judy Adams. I said hello. My name is in Cree, flying overhead in circles, Eagle Woman. And my mother is Judy Adams. And I bring that up because elders have been telling me when you're introducing yourself, you should always acknowledge where you come from. And my mother's family is from Fisher River. And Fisher River is originally, many of the people came down from Norway House. So in many ways, Kevin Brownlee and I, we decided that we are distant cousins. So there's another cousin of mine on the panel. So I'm very excited. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and talk about, I'm more of a storyteller. So let's see, oops. Sorry about that. Just trying to get this going here. Okay, so I'm more of a storyteller, so I'm really going to talk about like my own personal journey of challenging the legacy of colonialism and how I'm kind of redefining that position and reinterpreting pottery that were made by my ancestors. I am a practicing artist. I'm a full-time artist, and I'm happy to say and proud to say that I am an Indigenous woman that relies solely on my art practice to make a living, and not many Indigenous women can actually say that. So I'm going to first throw the Manitoba Museum under the bus in the beginning of my talk. Sorry, Kevin. Back in 2000, when I moved back to Manitoba after going to school at Concordia University, I wanted to explore my heritage because I grew up without knowing anything about my culture. And one of the things that I used to say to people was that I was assimilated and that I was okay with that. But at some point in time, I recognized, and I had many people telling me that you need to know where you come from. You need to explore who you are. And one of those things led me to take this course with Catherine Flynn, Dr. Lee Sims, and Marianne Tisdale. And we went down into the basement. I was taught about my Indigenous ancestors through their pottery work. And it was a hands-on approach. So we actually worked with commercial clay and we built vessels, trying to think about like the shapes and formations and what they thought of how these vessels were being created. I am well versed in clay. The first time I touched clay, it was like coming home. So I understood clay, especially commercial clay. But I did walk away from that experience disheartened. I walked away thinking, why are our vessels rough? They're not highly decorated as you would see in the States. The work by the Indigenous people down south. I didn't make a connection, and I walked away no longer wanting to pursue that method. Now, fast forward to 2014, Jenny Western, she curated a show called Shards, I think they called it, where they got Indigenous women to go down to meet Grant Golds, who's an experimental archaeologist, and he was going to teach us about Indigenous pottery that my ancestors made. And in this situation, this is a picture of me actually in the field digging the clay and Grant showing us how it was done. Here we are processing the clay, and here Grant is showing his techniques. Now, what was different about my experience at the Manitoba Museum and with Grant was the fact that we were doing land-based learning, that we were actually out on the land and I was touching the clay that the ancestors touched. I had never done that before up until this point. And what Grant taught me was how difficult this clay actually was, how sandy it was. And even though I had 20 years of experience working with clay, I was struggling and I had a difficult time. So suddenly I gained a new appreciation of the innovation and ingenuity that my ancestors showed in working with this very difficult clay. But it was miraculous at the same time, understanding that this technology, it heated food better, food and water, faster and better than metal does. It conducts heat better, it's non-stick, and the food tastes better. So these are all the things that I learned from Grant. And what happened was, and this is a picture of Grant with his theory on nettle bags being used in processing the vessels and getting that texture that you often see with the shards here, shards in Manitoba. One of the things also was to meet and to learn more about pottery through people like Kevin Brownlee. And I had been fangirling for a long time to meet him. And finally, I was able to meet him. And so what's really exciting is in this picture, I'm holding an actual vessel made by the ancestor that's in the collection of the Manitoba Museum. You can't see it on my face, but I am in seventh heaven at this point in time. Also, there's a vessel on the right side of my screen, and it's one of my favorite vessels. It has a large, giant pebble on the inside, and it's every time I see it or every time I touch it, it takes me back, and it makes that connection that I have with the ancestors. I also met with, at the University of Winnipeg, Val McKinnon. She showed us the pottery that was found in Lockport and different parts of Manitoba, mostly the southern regions of Manitoba. So we really got an amazing sort of introduction to Indigenous pottery. But the most significant was definitely with Grant Gold's being on the land and making those connections. And so this isn't the exhibition that I ended up creating, but this was for the La Maison des Artistes, and it was a landscape show. And within everything that you see on the ground, this is my idea of landscape. There's grandfather stones that were used in ceremonial sweats. Inner part, there's like crushed grandfathers, then there's crushed clay, and then there's the materials that are required for firing. So everything that Grant was teaching me was about taking materials from the land, using instruments from the land, using materials from the land, and building. And inside my vessel that is created based on all this land-based learning is a video that talks about water. It's different waterways that connected my ancestors. It's within wild rice. You can see the little bits of wild rice there, but it also has me singing in the background, singing to the water. And so it's a really beautiful, haunting song that plays while you're looking at this piece. So this experience, I can't state it enough. It's literally changed my life. It put me in a direction that I couldn't have anticipated. It made me understand the importance of learning where I come from. So I made it my mission to learn as much as I could, and I continue to do so, still learning as much as I can. And I got my own tools. I got my own learning methods that I've been picking up through practicing and through trial and error. And so here I'm at a water gathering, which we call the Niigaanwewidam water gathering, that's held every year in May, where my friend Aimee Craft had talked to elders, and she had asked them, what is it that you want to do to talk about the health and welfare of water? And she said, and they told her that they wanted to create a learning lodge on the land. Instead of having a going into a convention center or booking a venue inside, they wanted to be out on the land. They wanted to have a sacred fire going. They wanted to be able to talk and share knowledge about water and the importance of protecting it. And so I was invited in to talk about what I've been learning about clay. And so this is me talking in front of participants at the water gathering. And what I'm doing is I'm passing this knowledge onto the participants. And what happens is that the people would come to me and tell me how much it meant to them to learn about something that they'd never learned before. They had no idea that pottery was made in Manitoba. They had no idea about the technology. And so here I am passing out clay and sand and crushed grandfathers to give to the participants. And here they are creating their own smudge bowls. And then what's exciting about all of this is that we're doing this all out on the land. And then at the end of like our 3-day teachings about water, we would have a firing. And I'm just going to go forward here. I highly recommend people to watch this video that I created. It's about the firing method that we did for the water gathering. It's called Wabigan. And you can go on to YouTube and search for Wabigan. And what I didn't get, so I'm going to reflect a little bit on the first teaching when I learned about at the Manitoba Museum, was that there was incredibly good intentions about teaching about the Indigenous pottery. However, the negative effects is that it can't help but be immersed in a colonial structure, a colonial institution. And in many ways, that was very damaging for a person like myself who's trying to learn about my culture and trying to understand it. So what I want to recognize is that colonial systems are everybody has been raised in this sort of colonial structure. We can't get away from it. It's all around us. And that these kind of teaching methods in an institution, they have to recognize the biases that are within these teaching methodologies, and that it can be damaging, such as in my case. So there needs to be a reconsideration of the teaching. Teaching about Indigenous culture and heritage and knowledge. So that's where I think it's so important to always have elder consultation. I myself wasn't raised in my culture, but when I finally did start learning about it and start going to ceremonies and being taught by elders and being taught by knowledge carriers, I have incredible friends and incredible cousins too. They completely changed the way I looked at the world, and my connection to land and water changed because of these kind of experiences. Learning about ceremony, learning about spirit, learning about the relationship to land and water. And I also want to recognize, I didn't write this down, but recognize that blood memory is a very powerful thing within my community. It's very real, and it's now, scientists have shown that it actually exists, and of course it does. I also want to acknowledge that, that we need to bring in the original caretakers of the land and the knowledge carriers of this landscape. So whenever a teaching opportunity or a presentation opportunity happens, it's important that we bring them in on these kind of conversations. And another thing is that I think anyone who wants to try to understand how the colonial structure can impact, I think everyone should read Decolonizing Education, Nourishing the Learning Spirit by Marie Baptiste. I think it's an excellent way to move forward in a good way, because it's really about bringing together two ways of thinking. Now, obviously, the colonial structure is not going away. It's not going away anytime soon. However, what needs to happen instead is a rethinking about how we look at the world. And ever since I started to embrace my heritage and where I come from, it's impacted how I look at success. So I don't see success as being in the National Gallery of Canada, having an education in an institution, having a Bachelor of Fine Arts, or making money. How I see success now is what kind of legacy am I passing on? And that's why I'm tirelessly teaching Indigenous pottery to the next generation so that we can move forward in a good way. Because it's not just teaching about how to make pots. anybody can do that. What it is it's teaching people about that relationship that we needed to have with land and water. So with that, I think with 27 seconds to go, I am going to pass it on to the next person. So Miigwech Ekosi.
You're so on point for timing. 27 seconds.
I have my timer going.
Wow. You had 8 seconds left. So is there anything left you want to say with it? Anyway. Okay, we'll hand it off to Kevin. Kevin, take it away.
All right, thanks. I'll do my best to follow on Casey's lead in terms of that. Before we get started, I just want to recognize that we're on Treaty 1 land in the homeland of the Métis Nation and in the unceded territory of the Dakota. I want to give a little bit of sort of background, kind of the way Casey did when she started. My birth father's from Norway House, as Niigaan's pointed out, and but my birth mother's was from Rivers, Manitoban Scottish background. And I was raised in a non-Indigenous home here in Winnipeg. And that really, during my youth, I really sort of searched for my identity and where I came from. And that sort of drew me into sort of the field of archaeology. Now, as I look back on what I've sort of learned over the course of my career to this point, and seeing sort of this movement towards reconciliation, I think particularly where archaeology is concerned, I think we are more in a stage and with heritage at a point of reclamation. I think communities are starting to reclaim what was taken away, and that's sort of a necessary step before we move on to reconciliation. To really understand where the archaeology comes from, I think we need to start looking at sort of the history of where it is and in Canada and here in Manitoba as well. It sort of was under the guise of archaeology, but back in the 1800s, people went in and started digging up burial mounds and explored all kinds of places. A real terrible sort of legacy left at that time, but it really sort of formed a real negative perception towards archaeologists. Unfortunately, that same sort of attitude went into the general perceptions. There were some real outlandish ideas about who made the mounds and that they were some lost race and that they were much more sophisticated than First Nation people. And I think that really sort of, justified the land grab that was about to take place in the 1800s, and that, if First Nation people were new to the land, it was much easier to sort of say they don't have title. And so I really think that was an unfortunate part of the history of sort of archaeology. If we sort of fast forward and when archaeology sort of became more sort of formalized in the province and across the country, in the 1960s through sort of the 90s, I mean, a lot of where archaeology money went to nationally was to the National Historic Sites. And these tended to be ones that were European of nature and helped build the country of Canada. And I think this is where we have to sort of start looking at what archaeology does, or what maybe it's used by sort of the public good. And it's certainly all about nation building. And I think that when federal governments are putting in money towards things like work, and important, this is not to take away, but important work at whether it's Upper Fort Garry or Lower Fort Garry, York Factory, these, the focus was certainly on Canada as a nation, an emerging nation. And so, and if you look globally at where money has been put to doing archaeology projects, those countries that have that real strong tie to the past and deep past certainly put more money towards that part of it. And I think there's sort of this lack of understanding and recognition of the ancient heritage that First Nation people have been here. And we're certainly seeing the change now. We're seeing more archaeology done at National Historic Sites that are focused on Indigenous and pre-European contact. But again, I think this is a legacy that we kind of got to sort of face and look at. I mean, when I first started getting into archaeology as a career, I was really saddened because I was approached by some people within the community and saying, you know, I was a bit of a traitor, and how I was, you know, archaeology was something that was done to us rather than by us. And, you know, I was really fortunate to sort of come along in the early 90s, and I was not the first Indigenous archaeologist on the scene, and I sort of talked to them about my experiences, and a lot of them had similar experience, like situations of being told that we were traitors. And they sort of, you know, had the same idea as I did, is that, you know, if we want for our communities to start being empowered and take ownership over our past, we need to be involved in this field. And, you know, it sort of takes me a bit to, in the late 90s and early 2000s, I started on this National Heritage granting program advisory board. And, you know, I was super excited the very first year that 1 out of about 80 applications said something about archaeology, and these were coming from community. And a couple of years later, I was invited back to that same sort of funding organization, and this time there was like maybe 10. And then a couple of years later, I went back again, and about half of them. And I think this is where we're starting to see reclamation of Indigenous communities saying, you know, like, this past is ours, and we want to start taking a more active and a major role in reclaiming this side of our past. You know, I've been really fortunate to be at the museum for, I think it's now 17 years. And one of the projects I started on really early was one with the community of Okawamithakani First Nation in Granville Lake. And the headman there had invited me up to the community in 2006. And he, in his backyard was a, you know, early 1800s fur trade post. And it was very important to him, you know, like, and it was manicured, like they had the sort of the mowed lawn. And if anyone's familiar, these fur trade posts often had stone chimneys, and so there's this pile of stones in his backyard, and you know, it was recognized and sort of managed by him. Anyway, there was a soil contamination issue. The community got evacuated. When they came back, that whole site had been completely demolished. And he thought, man, if this is how they're treating, you know, what is sort of a shared European First Nation history and site, how are they going to treat things that are mine? And so he invited me and a group of us into the community to start working and documenting sacred landscapes, oral history, and through that process, we were able to document these mines and where First Nation people have been mining and chipping out quartz for something like maybe as long as 8,000 years. And, you know, and not just a little bit. I mean, I think one of the quarries that we took a look at, 200 metric tons of rock had been removed. So this is major activity of First Nation people being miners. You know, and then it got spun when it got picked up by the media. You know, here's this curator of archaeology discovers mines in northern Manitoba. And again, I think this was such a disservice because I was just a facilitator. I was shown these places. I didn't discover anything. And I think the more work I do with communities, I mean, Casey spoke on it, you know, it's really, you know, it's acknowledging where the levels and where areas of expertise are. And I, you know, certainly take a back seat when I'm working with community. You know, they know best. They know their area and how we sort of proceed with that. And yeah, it was just a really wonderful opportunity as we sort of really started exploring how this sort of collaborative project with the museum could go. I think foundational to that was really how the community was instrumental in sort of developing what it was that were the goals of the project. And they really wanted to see youth in the community engaged. They wanted to see this as an opportunity to sort of give these youth a sense of pride of their history. And I think that's one thing that I was able to get. I mean, I got interested in archaeology when I was 8. And when we start seeing, you know, youth taking sort of a bit of an ownership and feeling of pride of what their ancestors did, you know, moving away from the idea that we were, you know, somehow primitive and the technology was primitive. I mean, the work that Casey's been doing and Grant with ceramics, I mean, really shows the level of sophistication that we're looking at. And I think it's that Indigenous science that really helps spur that. The the other part that I really like with that really hands-on approach, it gives you a totally different experience and interpretation. And I think, as archaeologists to some degree are storytellers. I mean, we take science, we take oral history, we take various pieces and we piece them all together and we come up with a story to tell a narrative, and how we weave that together and what we say in the end. We are storytellers, and one thing that we have to be aware of is that we shouldn't feel bad that maybe our interpretations are disproven in the future. I think a good storyteller can accept the fact that things are going to change and something's going to come out, and we can change our perspectives, but we are, for all intents and purposes, trying to tell a narrative of the past. And for the Cree community where I'm from, culture and heritage is synonymous. And so when we're talking about heritage preservation, it's also cultural preservation. And so the link between those is so vital as we sort of move forward. I want to sort of talk sort of lastly about a project I worked with Sagkeeng from 1998 through about 2018. It ended with a final publication that came out in that year. And the book itself, was community-based. We worked with leadership and elders within the Sagkeeng on the accidental discovery of human remains or ancestral remains coming out of the banks of the Winnipeg River. And the community had asked the museum to come on board and help them create some educational materials for the community that can be useful in the education and the cultural center. And so we did that. And most of the people are at this summit can appreciate that we got only so far, and the publication of this final sort of manuscript got stalled because of a lack of funding. And so the manuscript I had created in the early 2002 or something, it basically sat on the shelf. And 15 years later, we got some money put into place to finally see this thing off. And I dusted it off, very excited to basically add in some new references and bring this out to the public and add some pictures, and realized it was terrible. And I think it was kind of a reflection of, we are trained within colonial institutions, and I was sort of following that same pattern of regurgitating how it is that I was taught. And in the years of mentoring under community members, really opened my eyes. And when I reread this manuscript, how off I was. And so I was then under a process of a rediscovery, and over the course of the next 3.5, 4 years, worked and repositioned the artifacts so they made sense to Anishinaabe youth in the community. I integrated Anishinaabe language into the book, used storytelling, and then integrated everything from, archaeology can be a little bit abstract sometimes when we're talking about things thousands of years in the past, and how do we engage youth. And so I wanted to integrate everything from contemporary art, ethnographic pieces, that there's this sort of unbroken connection. When we start talking, Casey talks about it with her ceramics, how she's got bond with the women who came before, and again, it's trying to present that to the youth. And I think as we see this book finally come out and talking about how this person would have tried to aspire to live a good life, and that they were living in balance between their spiritual, their mental, their emotional, and their physical, all of a sudden the book took a totally different turn. And I think I'm so proud of how it is now. I was really fortunate to work with an elder from the community, the late Mark Thompson. I remember early on when I was just kind of a student and being frustrated of not getting any traction in grants and trying to get this book underway. And he just would always say, it's going to happen when it's meant to happen. And I was like, no, I want it now. I want it to happen now. And he just kept on saying, this will happen when it's meant to happen. And, 18 years later, I never would have imagined it would have taken that long, or 20 years. But we finally got it out. And I think it did the ancestor justice, and being able to tell something a little bit more meaningful to the community, and, using something that, archaeology that has been used disenfranchised communities as a way of moving forward and really sort of sharing that reclamation of heritage back into the communities. And with that, I think I am just about out of time.
Okay. Well, you had 6 seconds left. So
oh, yeah.
We have all these, the first two, Casey and Kevin, you have just thrown the idea of native time out the window because you're on point, perfectly timed, adequate. Adele, you have a really big follow-up because literally they just destroyed cultural stereotypes and obliterated them right off the beginning. So we'll hand it off to Adele Perry. Go ahead.
I will be like the white lady that walks into this and blows, my time and talks over everybody. No, hopefully not. So I'm really honored to be, living here in Treaty 1 as a treaty partner, drinking water from Treaty 3 in general. And I'm honored particularly to be part of this panel. Adele Perry Niigaanwewidam, Gawin Niigaanwewidam, Winnipeg Ninduji, Zaganashkwe Ninda. My name is Adele Perry. I don't know my clan. I live here in Winnipeg. I'm originally from British Columbia, from a settler background. I've lived here in Manitoba for a little over 20 years. And I'm going to share slides here because sometimes I like to have some visuals to go along with this. And what I want to sort of talk to is sort of my kind of perspective here as a historian. So I'm a professor of history and women's and gender studies at the University of Manitoba. I'm also the incoming director of the Center for Human Rights Research. And as somebody who's taught and done research in history and been involved in historical organizations, in particular, I am past president of the Canadian Historical Association, which is a national body of kind of history professionals. I'm interested in where the histories and the cultures and the heritages that have been sort of discussed so powerfully on this panel so far lead us, and how they prompt us or should prompt us to think differently about history and heritage and commemoration. So to sort of return to some of the questions that Dr. Sinclair raised in the introduction, in a sense, what I kind of want to address is where these questions of indigenization, if we can understand them as such, lead us to, or should lead us to, rethinking how we present history and heritage as a whole. So in other words, how an adequate or even partial sort of project of indigenization, I think should lead us to a rethinking and to a kind of beginnings of decolonization, recognizing how partial and flawed that project will necessarily be. So I don't know if people can see my slides. I'm looking for a nod. Is anybody the slides are up? Okay, great.
Oh,
Thank you very much. Okay, perfect. So Casey began by throwing the Manitoba Museum under the bus. So I'm going to begin by throwing Doug Auram's book, Born at the Right Time, under the bus. Also, the Royal BC Museum in Victoria's Old Town exhibit under the bus, which is an awful lot like the Winnipeg exhibit at the Manitoba Museum, if anybody needs a connection. And also I have here an obelisk, which sits at Stephen Juba Park and has a number of plaques and other heritage markers commemorating in different ways the aqueduct that links Winnipeg to Shoal Lake. And these are 3 images that speak to different kind of levels of both heritage, history writing, and commemoration. And in different ways, what I think they kind of reflect is a view of these histories that privileges a very specific settler perspective. And what I want to suggest that if we take Indigenous histories of dispossession, but also of Indigenous brilliance and capacity and genius seriously, we need to rethink both scholarly writing about history and also teaching. We need to rethink heritage, and we also need to rethink commemoration. And there's lots of examples I could pick. I'm going to come back to the Old Town Museum in Victoria, and also the water commemoration in conclusion. But I want to get to that by talking a little bit about some of the research I've been doing for, I guess, the last 5 or 6 years that is tries to kind of re-examine histories of Winnipeg through water, and through relationships of colonialism, the dispossession of Indigenous peoples broadly, but in particular the dispossession of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and Anishinaabe community in Treaty 3 that borders the provinces of Manitoba and Ontario, in the interests of providing what was a growing settler city with adequate drinking water. And what I want to kind of suggest here is that this is a really kind of archetypal story that suggests not simply the way that Indigenous histories and experiences need to be kind of acknowledged within a heritage or history framework, but how, if we're doing any of this right, we need to use those histories to really substantially reframe how we see the histories, for instance, of modern Winnipeg as a whole. So I wrote about this in a little book, which is pictured here, that was published by ARP a couple of years ago, and it's called Aqueduct, surprisingly enough, because it's about an aqueduct, and that's the research I'm going to be drawing on. I wrote the book pretty quickly, kind of as a intervention into what was then kind of a public conversation about all of these questions, but it's something I've continued to kind of work on, and I'll draw a little bit on that research today. And what this research kind of gets back to are early years in the 20th century in the city of Winnipeg, and a moment where Winnipeg had entered, where Winnipeg had been produced out of a context of Anishinaabe, Cree, and Métis territories, and in particular, a transition from Red River to Manitoba, what we are supposed to be marking this year, though we've kind of postponed. The city of Winnipeg, as it was sort of reframed in the early 1870s, had very, very modest population growth in the years following the Manitoba Act, but things really, really shifted, not in response to that political transition, but in the early years of the 20th century, where you just see this massive spike in the population. And this is a population that is increasingly non-Indigenous. So this is an Indigenous space that is being remade as at best unfriendly, and at times very, very hostile to Indigenous people, and where non-Indigenous arrival is occurring in really rapid numbers. And this tests the capacity of people in this place to live in relationship with the water. And I'm drawing here on some of the work that Casey Adams referred to earlier by scholars like Aimee Craft and others, like Deborah McGregor, who have talked about the particular way that water in Anishinaabe thinking is not a resource, but is something that is lived in relationship to. And I think in these years, Winnipeg's capacity to live in relationship to the water really falls apart dramatically. And the biggest register of that is really significant rates of typhoid. So the smaller image there you can see is what kind of an early 20th century version of what we would now call a heat map. And as we now live through a pandemic, this is an earlier pandemic, and this is one around typhoid. And what you can see there is the city's public health folks mapping cases of typhoid. And what they find is that cases of typhoid are really concentrated in parts of the city that have the least access to decent drinking water. And this prompts a return to old questions about the city's drinking water and how it might solve these problems. And what kind of comes as a political solution in the 1910s is an older idea, which is to build a massively expensive, massively ambitious in both political and other terms project, which is to build an aqueduct linking the city of Winnipeg to the Lake of the Woods watershed. And that's a solution that kind of gels in around 1912. And it's a solution ultimately that involves a dispossession of land and resources that even by early 20th century terms is drastic, radical, without conversation, without remorse, without any meaningful engagement of the Indigenous community who has so much at stake. So in particular, the city asked the permission of the federal government, who eventually uses a component of the Indian Act that absolved them of even any necessity to have any kind of meetings or process or conversation. And instead simply to take Shoal Lake 40's reserve land because it was deemed in the interest of quote unquote public works. And so this is called Section 46. And you've got here the text of the Indian Act, and the letter that's on the left there is from the archives in Ottawa, and that's actually where you can see in handwriting where federal officials are signing off on this and saying, this is a Section 46 case. And what happens really is that Shoal Lake 40 loses critical parts of their reserve land. The reserve is trisected, it's cut into 3 parts. And this is a deal that is negotiated at the highest levels of the Canadian state between Duncan Campbell Scott from the Department of Indian Affairs and Mayor Thomas Russ Deacon, who took the train to Ottawa to cut this deal. And it's one that the community of Shoal Lake 40 had an enormous stake in. And this would be measured in a number of ways, including most significantly or most kind of revealingly for, I think, how we think about colonialism and settler colonialism and what it's meant for all of us. The way that this led in kind of through a series of steps to that community not being able to drink its own water. And Shoal Lake 40 was put on a drinking water advisory in the late 1990s. They are in the process of building a water treatment plant, but they remain under a drinking water advisory. It's been unbroken for 22 years. And so in this sense, the story of Winnipeg and Shoal Lake 40 is an archetypal story of colonialism, whereby the Canadian state works in a way to take a resource from an Indigenous community and reallocate it to a settler community. And we can think about how that happens with land. We can think about how it happens with resources like hydro. But here we see how it happens with water. And that's just an image there, which I should have showed you a little bit earlier, showing the parts of the land that are kind of rendered there in kind of yellow that were basically stolen by the Greater Winnipeg Water District in order to produce Winnipeg's aqueduct. That's also from the National Archives in Ottawa. And many of you who are Winnipeggers are familiar with this story, I think at this point, including non-Indigenous Winnipeggers like myself, though I think that's really a measure of the changes that have occurred in the last 10 years, where the community of Shoal Lake 40 has worked really assiduously and with kind of enormous dedication and skill to raise this history and to shift public awareness of it. So when I first moved to Winnipeg 20 years ago, I remember I had this vague knowledge that there were kind of issues with the city's water, but I didn't know what they were. And the fact that I know more now, and that I think the community as a whole knows more now, is a testament to the way that Indigenous communities, in this case Shoal Lake 40, have really prompted and really demanded this sort of change. But what I want to think about here is what this means for how we think about history and how we narrate things like the history of Winnipeg. And I mean that in our classrooms, including the ones that Professor Sinclair and I teach in. I mean in museums, I mean in public spaces, I mean in commemorative spaces. And this is an image here from the Winnipeg Tribune in the 1930s. And what we can sort of see here is how Winnipeg's history of water and the aqueduct and things associated with it got kind of framed in this kind of narrative arc, whereby the bad olden days was what came before, and this was very much the good olden days that showed us better health, that showed us access to the things that made life easier, healthier, and better for many people. And what we kind of get here is kind of a very small window into a general way that I think 20th century Canadian history has been narrated again and again and again, which is as a tale of kind of upwards and onwards and of improvement. And this is a narrative framing that runs in distinct contradiction to the experience of many, many Indigenous peoples who have experienced those exact years as periods that witnessed the growth of residential schooling, the consolidation of a reserve system, the loss of lands, the development of segregated healthcare. I mean, all of this is information that we should be aware of and probably are. But I think we also need to think a little bit about how we might revisit these histories and these ways of thinking of the past and of heritage in ways that take these histories, for instance, of Winnipeg and water and Shoal Lake 40, not as kind of an addendum or a little bit of a backstory that might be useful. So a lot of the way sometimes it's framed in these discussions is it's talked about as sort of a dark chapter. And if you Google dark chapter in Canadian history, you get a lot about residential schooling. You get a fair bit about the internment of Japanese Canadians in World War II and of Ukrainian Canadians in World War I. But it's this sort of idea that these are histories that are separate, that are different, and that they can be kind of bracketed away and put somewhere else. And we can still continue to tell the story, for instance, of the post-war era as a story of people who were born at the right time, as Doug Auram did. Even though this was also a moment, for instance, where the Métis community of Roostertown in Winnipeg was finally dispossessed, where the African Canadian community of Africville in Nova Scotia and of Hogan's Alley in Vancouver were taken apart, where we can continue to kind of narrate these histories in ways that I think do real damage to how we see them as a whole, but also to the ability of all of us, including kids and students who are the sort of often the consumers of these things, to see themselves and their own histories in these books, in these exhibits, in these monuments and statues. So what I guess I want to think about, and I don't know how I'm doing for time because I meant to turn on my little timer, but I don't know if I did. How am I doing, Professor Sinclair? Okay. I figure, okay, I'll turn it back on.
I just sent you a message.
Okay, very good, thank you. I think what it does is it really prompts us to think differently about these histories and do so in ways that I think find more space for this. So just a couple of things I just wanted to mention. One is a recent series of short films about Shillelagh 40 that were produced, directed by Angelina Red Sky McLeod, who's also a graduate student at the University of Manitoba. They're free to stream, so as part of your pandemic educational experience, they're a good thing to watch, and they very much tell the story of what happened at Shillelagh 40 that I've sort of mentioned a little bit here. But I will also just end with thinking a little bit about these histories of the post-war, of the years following World War II. And I have two images, one arguing a study that argued for the destruction of Africville, another a newspaper documenting a little bit about Roostertown as Winnipeg's quote unquote lost suburbs. And I began with throwing Doug Auram over the bus, so I guess I'll return to that here. And the point I want to make is that the people that Auram is writing about just weren't born at the right time, because lots of other people were born at that time too, and they experienced a very different history of post-war Canada. And if our histories and our commemoration, our heritage is to be adequate to the complicated colonial present that we all live in, it has to take these histories out of a kind of framing as a dark chapter or something that happened somewhere else and put them at the center of how we understand this place and what it means to live here. And that is true for those of us who are non-Indigenous as well. So I think that's what I've got to say.
Okay.
I never got your message, or I couldn't see it while I was showing my slides.
That's pretty good. I believe you were 12 seconds over.
Oh, darn. Oh, wow.
You've stolen that from Casey and Kevin, who generously gave you that time.
I acknowledge there are 12 seconds.
No, I'm just joking. So I believe we have a taped presentation from Stan. And do we want to just key that up, Gordon, or?
Yes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is entitled Changing Times Today and the Need for a New Flag. This year marks 150 years since the inception of Manitoba as a province. There are many memories, no doubt, that are brought to bear, including the provisional government of Louis Riel, the buffalo, which was a rich economic resource of the time on which the Indigenous people depended at that time. But where did the word Manitoba originate? There are two stories about its origin. First, there's a story that Manitoba originated from the Narrows in Lake Manitoba. It is further believed that Manitoba originated from the Cree word Manitou Wapu, or the Ojibwe word Manitoba, which both mean Straits of Manitou, or the Great Spirit. This refers to the Straits of Lake Manitoba. Further, it is believed Thomas Spence, a settlement leader near Portage la Prairie at the time, used the word in reference to the lake and the surrounding territory. At the time, they wished to call the territory the Republic of Manitoba. And this was around the year 1868, before the Manitoba Act, which was formally established in 1870. The second version of Manitoba's origin comes from the Whiteshell area. The story is that it's derived, the word is derived from a Whiteshell area where various petroforms existed and where a certain rock existed from time immemorial, which is referred to as Manitoba Bay, which means God, where God sits. It is not known how far back the reference to Manitoba Bay existed or was used in the common language of the Ojibwe. However, it is quite possible that it pre-existed the name of Lake Manitoba and the surrounding territory, and was simply used at that time at 1868 because the word already existed. And speaking about our flag in Manitoba, when we look at the current Manitoba flag, there is little there to signify Manitoba's origins. The flag was adopted in 1966. The current flag, however, smacks of many colonialist symbols. And there are a number of things on the flag. As you know, it's a red flag with a crest of a buffalo and a red cross on top. Now, the red cross is that of St. George, dominating over the buffalo, it seems, it appears. Maybe that's not the intent, but that's the way it looks, like the cross of St. George dominates. The cross of St. George itself came from Greek. It has Greek origins, and St. George was a warrior, and it was adopted by many different warrior groups in England, and that became the patron saint of England. It has also the Union Jack on the red flag, which is, of course, British. And the red designs, of course, you know, they all wear red coats as well, comes from the British. We might ask today, after 150 years, if this flag is relevant to Manitoba as a province in terms of its symbols. Does it do justice to Manitoba as a province? In an article published some time back, is Manitoba's 150th the chance to redo the province's flag. Bryce Hoy of CBC News quotes a high school student, Connor McFarlane, from Selkirk in stating, "It's quite Anglo-centric and it ignores the roles of Indigenous people have played in the founding of the province, as well as the role of the French community." As well, he states, it's not the most inclusive flag in the world. Conclusively then, in this era of reconciliation, McFarlane considers the British Union Jack and the red ensign to be colonialist symbols of the past that are un-Manitoban. It has nothing to do with Manitoba as a province, in other words. We can conclude therefore, that the current provincial flag has little to do with our current status of affairs here in Manitoba. There are some possibilities if we wish to change the flag. One possibility is that we have to concentrate on the word what Manitoba means, first of all, and it needs some consideration. The word reflects the name Manitou, or the Great Spirit, and ought to be reflected on the flag itself. Secondly, as well, Manitoba is the center of Canada. And as you know, many Indigenous people look at the center as a sacred place. And that should be reflected on the flag as well, that Manitou takes the center of the Manitoba flag. Third, Manitoba today is multicultural and multi-faith. Perhaps a circle to depict the unity as a province and a variety of colors would symbolize this diversity. The importance of family can also be reflected by 4 colors and stand for the women, the youth or children, the men, and the elders. And this encases the whole family life of the province. Every culture in this province has such people, women, youth, men, and elders. This covers the whole population then of Manitoba. For a background, I would suggest maybe blue can be used for the many lakes in Manitoba that we have. And as you know, we are a great transporter of hydro and electricity. And also white can be used for the winter months that where we experience the winter. At any rate, there are many other options possible that could be suggested. And this year, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the province then, I would strongly recommend a change in the provincial flag to reflect its present reality. In doing so, we require a decolonization of the provincial flag. In that way, therefore, we can reflect our changing times and our true heritage as a province. As President Reagan once remarked, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I appeal, therefore, to the people of Manitoba, Manitobans, tear down this flag. Thank you.
Holy smokes. What a call to action. Okay, well, there we go. So we've been assigned and by, wow, that was a pretty fierce talk. Very, it reminds me a lot of kind of, I think people often characterize our elders as being these kind of soft, you know, kindly drinking tea kind of, but you know, our elders are fierce, brilliant activists who do awesome things and frankly require us to be better than we often are, or that we've often been taught to be. And so we saw a beautiful talk there. I was really reminded of, you know, when we wrote Manitowabo, which was Warren and I did, we talked about the fact Manitoba has two names. And I love that Stan's talking about the complexity within Manitoba. And that's really the ongoing theme that's come through all of Casey, Kevin, and Adele's talks, is about complexity and the issues around representation of history. But most importantly, the story that hasn't been included within that complexity that has perhaps been we are all lesser than is because of Indigenous voices, Indigenous communities, and Indigenous knowledge that hasn't been included in much of the delivery. And the excellent examples that Casey, Kevin, and Adele have brought in, involving Adele talking about space, Kevin talking about really life and remains, and then also the voices that come from that. And then Casey talking about really pottery as being intersections of all these different relationships. And it's not just about, I love your thing where you said, well, anybody can do pottery, but like, it's all about the process and the outcomes and what's created as a result of the pottery. And that's all a beautiful segment. We've got one real question. What I've been told, and what Gordon just sent me a message, he said the rest of the conference is canceled just for this panel. So we're going to spend 7 hours just together. So way to go, Gordon. I appreciate that. Adele, you ready? 8 hours straight for this with me?
I'm here. I'm ready.
All right. I want to throw the question at you. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get a chance to everybody to respond it, but I'm just going to throw it at you. So William's asking right now, he said, one of the biggest obstacles to understanding and sharing Indigenous heritage in Manitoba is really outdated cultural resource management laws and the lack of a regulatory body for archaeologists. And what this often means is that it's really, archaeology is not really done to an acceptable standard. And what the resulting knowledge that's created, it's restricted to reports that are internal to engineering and consulting companies involved in those excavations. I can tell you that absolutely all of these archival reports at the Forks, for example, are really some of the reasons why some of that improper treatment of Indigenous heritage continues. Do any of you have any suggestions for grassroots actions that could address some of these issues? And Kevin, if you don't say something here, I'm going to just thoroughly disappoint you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that Manitoba is, we're certainly very development focused rather than, you know, I mean, like the archaeology, you know, projects like the one that I did with Granville Lake and with that community where it was like, you know, seeking answers that the community had are the exception rather than the norm. And I think the more we move towards, I mean, you know, archaeology is always sort of has a component where it is certainly development driven. And I think, you know, where hopefully communities are starting to take a more active role in that process, standards change. You know, I mean, like you're not accounting to a development company, you're accountable to the community whose heritage you're dealing with. And I think when you change the reporting sort of mechanism, I think it certainly changes the quality of what's in there. I mean, I think I had one of my friends, a Anishinaabe friend of mine down in Minnesota, and he's an archaeologist, and he sort of said, you know, like high standards of doing archaeology. When he's dealing with developers, he said, that should be seen as your insurance. You pay a lot of money to do the pre-development work so that you don't get, graders and gravel operators or whatever stopped mid activity. And you can go with the cheapest, the least expensive, but you are opening yourself up to that. And then you're starting to talk language that developers actually understand. But it's a challenge, yeah.
I mean, Adele, your work is really just talking about truth and the work that's already in the archives that shows the evidence of really the obliteration of Indigenous presence. I'm really thinking about Roostertown. Evelyn Peters writes about that. But what you're talking about is the aqueduct as being all the evidence was there in the archives illustrating the characterization of the city, the ways sickness or lack of water impacts the city, and then what happens as a result of that. I mean, isn't it just means a grassroots act? And for people who are watching right now, just look at the archive more closely or look at a way you haven't been taught before.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is a lot of, sometimes, or at least when I kind of came to history, there was this sort of just, kind of language that the issue around these questions was the paucity of sources. And I think one of the things that in particular Indigenous historians have made incredibly clear over the last couple of decades is the archives is full of this material. But what it is sort of the paucity of people reading it in ways that are attentive and register it and see it as being significant. But I think there's also a thing there. It's also about how we size the relative truths. I think there's very few people that would argue that these things, were not important, didn't happen, that kind of thing. But I still think what we get in kind of many sort of textbooks, displays, that kind of stuff, is that they're just treated as not shifting the overall story. In other words, they're kind of bracketed as a sort of a different chapter that can kind of be explained differently, where the dominant sort of arc and narrative and point we walk away from in Canadian history continues to march onwards, and in particular in ways that really kind of radically erase Indigenous experience.
Just to finish off here, we heard from Stan, KC, we heard from Stan just saying, let's just do it. And I love that at the end, he's like, everybody go down, let's tear down the flags, which is like, and that's really the work that you're doing, which is you're not waiting for legitimacy. You're not waiting for archives to talk about pottery in the appropriate relational way that you're doing it. You're just doing it. And so I love that your work, I mean, you're talking about it as an art, but it's engaging life practice. It's doing what we've always done in the kind of life practice ways. Could you also see that as maybe a resistance to the way that pottery has been formed, like you were talking about, as throwing the museum under the bus, but how important that is just to go and do it, just to live the process, engage it, learn from it, eat the food?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't just talking about the Manitoba Museum. I think it's representation of the past of my culture, the lack of representation of my culture. I think Kevin and I have talked a lot about how frustrating that it is. Like myself, I've traveled to the Museum of History in Hull, Quebec, just to try to find any sort of artifacts or clothing or bags, just so that I can understand my culture better. It's really about trying to change that narrative through a hands-on approach from sort of a grassroots kind of approach. I'm not funded by an institution. I'm not getting paid for all of this research that I'm doing. I'm doing this because this is my idea of success. This is my idea of moving forward in a good way and then giving back to my community. I don't want another child growing up who was like myself, who was felt inferior because of the color of my skin or how I looked. I don't want another child to grow up without examples that I'm giving. I'm trying to be a positive role model in my community. I want children to look at me. So I go into schools, I should say that. I go into schools to teach children about Indigenous pottery and the inventiveness of my people and the innovation. And one of the things I think that really needs to happen right away is the word primitive needs to be taken off the board whenever talking about our people. Yeah. It's in everywhere I look, in all the research material that I'm reading, and we have to really be critical of that, and also how do we move forward, and we need to have more Indigenous scholars writing about our past. We need more elders being part of those discussions and part of that educational system and structures. But also, you know, I'm a big advocate for changing our relationships that we have with land and water, instead of looking at it as a resource, looking at it as our relative.
Yeah. I was reminded, I was teaching my intro class this morning, and today was our Indigenous science class. And what the theme that comes up as you study Indigenous science, or the way that scientists are coming to Indigenous science, is Indigenous science has all the answers that Western science can't provide. And that it is Indigenous science that is the most innovative to understand Turtle Island, or the land, or the water, or why the animals migrate the way they do, or how we pick berries, or why why the sun particularly reflects in this direction on the stars or on the northern lights and so on. My point of saying it is that Indigenous peoples, I guess I'll just pull a Stan Fontaine and say, we have all the answers. So science. Time you come to us, archaeologists, it's time you come to us instead of expecting us to come to you. And one thing I love about Casey's message there. So I want to say huge miigwech. Normally what I would do is I would all just present my thanks, and I would give you all a wonderful hug and miigwech. But we are in the time of COVID, so we don't have that luxury in which we can spend time with one another physically. But we can spend time each other with these little boxes on the screen that I get to hang out with my friends for an hour 15. I get to experience wonderful time with people that I'm getting to know for the first time, like Gordon and the other people who put together this panel. But I want to say huge miigwech to Casey, Kevin, and Adele. Also Stan, wherever you are in the world. He's probably out tearing flags down right now. Probably doing right now. But miigwech, Casey, Kevin, and Adele for coming and joining with the Manitoba Heritage Summit. Thanks for coming. And I'm going to pass this back to Gordon. Gordon's going to give people some instructions on how to do the next session, and also a feature that the conference is offering, I understand, in terms of a discussion room. So I'll hand it over to you, Gordon.
Thank you very, very much to you and your panelists, Niigaan. There's one more piece for us to show you. Stay with us for a moment.
Mr. Fontaine, we would like to offer you this gift of tobacco in respect of your experience and wisdom, and we are very grateful for your participation.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again, folks. Wonderful panel discussion and lots to learn from it. All right, we need to move on to our next panel.